A procession of apparitions, a mysterious corpse clutching a Buddhist prayer bead, the final resting place of 25,000 red light district workers, and the execution grounds of the Tokugawa shogunate. Is this Tokyo's most cursed section of train track? We'll take a ride through history, and our first stop is the last stop for the condemned of Old Edo. Today on Ghostly Japan. Good evening and welcome. I am Azazel, and this is the first installment in my series on some of Japan's most haunted and cursed locations. In each video, we'll be discussing the stories of paranormal encounters that allegedly are taking place at each haunted location. We will take a closer examination at the history behind those stories, and in doing so, hopefully we'll come away with a better understanding and some context on why such a place has gained a reputation for the paranormal. Today, we're taking a look at a 2-kilometer stretch of railroad track in Arakawa Ward, Tokyo. This short stretch of track has such a history of suffering with death and misfortune packed on the literal ground the rail was built on. It is no wonder that there are numerous stories of paranormal encounters. Everything from riders of the trains reporting ghostly handprints appearing on the windows, unexplained screams and moans in the middle of the night, to shadow people being seen platforms and walking along the train tracks themselves. Located in the northeast section of Tokyo, Arakawa is one of the 12 special wards that make up the city. The area we're talking about today, though, is in the southern portion of the ward. More specifically, it is the stretch of track on the Joban line between Minami-Senju Station to Mikawashima Station. The area in question is one that historically has been home to blue-collar families. While Arakawa might not have the same draw for tourists as places like Shibuya, Shinjuku, Ikebukuro, Asakusa, Ueno, and others, Arakawa does have a number of notable places, such as the Nippori Fabric Town, the Koreatown near Mikawashima, and the last surviving operational section of the old Tokyo tram system, amongst other places. These are all places that have histories tied to Arakawa's past as Tokyo's manufacturing and industrial hub during the Meiji period. It also has a Michelin-rated ramen shop, famed for its shoyu ramen. But that's not what we're here for today. Today, we're talking about the dark history that some prefer to forget. A history that might be responsible for the numerous paranormal encounters and ghostly figures haunting commuters and locals alike. So let's start our journey at Minami-Senju Station, and we'll make our way west, along the train tracks, back to Mikawashima Station. Our train ride will take a mere 3 minutes, but it's 3 minutes that travels through 370 some odd years of death, misfortune, and the darker impulses of humanity. It's here at Minami-Senju that our story starts. Imagine, if you will, that you are walking towards Minami-Senju Station from the north side. As you near the station, you walk past a building next door with a large golden mon, or crest, of the Tokugawa clan. If the gate is open, you might see a graveyard on the other side of the building. Unless you stop to investigate further, you probably wouldn't pay it any further attention. You walk into the station and pass through the turnstiles and head on up to the platform to wait for the train. As you stand waiting, perhaps you feel an unexplainable sense of dread or feel an overwhelming sense of sadness. Sudden onsets of emotions that have no explanation. You wouldn't be the first to report such feelings. If it's nighttime, you might catch a shadowy figure standing on the platform out of the corner of your eye, but when you turn to look, there's no one there. As the train arrives, you shake whatever unease or unsettling encounters from your mind and enter the safety of the train. Taking a seat as the doors close and the train leaves the station, you get a better view of the backside of the building with the large crest on the front. You'll see that the building is actually a Buddhist temple, and what's more is that there's another temple on the other side of the tracks as well. On either side, as the train exits the station, you are flanked by temples, and both with substantial cemeteries. The one on the south side of the tracks has a sizable jizo, a Buddhist statue in the cemetery. If you are especially perceptive, you might even notice that the temples line up with one another. In other words, if one were to look down from the top, the train tracks are going right through the middle of a large graveyard, and that is only half of what the story is. For in reality, the train tracks are crossing through the former Kozukappara execution grounds. Established in 1651 by the Tokugawa shogunate, Kozukappara was a 108 by 54 meter yard that was one of the 3 official designated areas where executions were carried out. All 3 locations were on the outskirts of what was then called Edo, as Tokyo was known in those times, and all 3 were placed next to the major avenues for entry into the Tokugawa's seat of power. The official reason for the placement of the killing grounds was that the business of executing criminals was a spiritually unclean activity, and as such the shogunate did not want to spiritually soil the city. However, the conspicuous placement next to what was essentially the highways in and out of the city seems to suggest that the Tokugawas wanted all to witness what happens to anyone who dares challenge their authority. During the Tokugawa's rule, there were 6 legally codified death sentences that could be meted out depending on the severity and the nature of the offense. There were 3 different types of beheading: crucifixion, immolation, and death by sawing. Beheading was the most common sentence carried out during the Edo period, and there were 3 different types that could be carried out. The lightest of them was called geshunin in Japanese. It meant a simple beheading, after which the family and loved ones of the condemned were allowed to retrieve their body and give them a proper burial. A step up in severity was shizai, which was also a beheading. However, the property of the condemned would also be confiscated by the state, and their family was not allowed to retrieve the body. If the crime was considered especially egregious, then before the execution they would be paraded through town, a shame walk like in Game of Thrones, except the condemned were allowed to keep their clothes on. If katana were in need of testing, the condemned's body was fair game for that purpose. After the execution, the body would be thrown in a shallow mass grave. At night, it was said stray dogs and other wildlife would come and were allowed to scavenge from the corpses. This form of beheading was considered appropriate for everything from robbery to fraud. The most serious of the beheadings was gokumon. As in the case of shizai, one's property was confiscated, and depending on the exact nature of the crime, the condemned could be paraded around town prior to the execution. The difference was, once the condemned was executed, the severed head would be placed on display next to the gate of the entrance to the killing grounds for 3 days and 2 nights. Afterwards, the body was disposed of in a shallow grave. This form of punishment had existed in Japan since antiquity, but it was the Tokugawa government that codified it and made its use in Edo-era criminal justice much more common. Gokumon was reserved for those convicted of murder in the commission of a robbery, murder of relatives of one's master, murder of landowners and landlords, and the manufacture of fraudulent scales and standards. The Japanese method of crucifixion differs slightly from Western methods. The condemned was tied to the cross, and for men, a support peg was placed under the groin, and for women, a support peg was placed under their feet. The condemned was then repeatedly stabbed with spears on the left and right side, under the ribs in an upward motion, with the spear being twisted each time the condemned was stabbed. This was not a quick method, as after each thrust, the blood of the condemned was cleaned from the spear with straw to ensure that the blood didn't run down the spear and soil the executioner's hands. After 30 blows were delivered with the spears to the sides of the condemned, at this point a long rake was used to hold the prisoner's head up, and one final spear was thrust into the throat from the right to the left. Mercifully, most prisoners were observed to have died after the second or third blow. The body was then left on the cross for 3 days and 2 nights, at which point it was removed and dumped into a shallow pit. A shame walk through the city could also precede the execution if the authorities wanted. The executions were conducted publicly, and it was noted that first-time observers often became physically ill. Crucifixion was a sentence often associated with the crime of counterfeiting money, injuring your master or your parents. Additionally, Travel within Japan was heavily regulated during this time, and being caught attempting to cross a checkpoint without a pass was a crime punishable by crucifixion as well. Immolation. The execution itself was almost always preceded by a shame walk through the city. Once the condemned arrived at the execution grounds, they were tied to a pillar on a bamboo frame. Their bonds were coated in mud to ensure that they didn't burn up in the subsequent inferno. Wood was loaded around the frame and the fire was set. The execution was not considered completed until the nose and the scrotum had been completely consumed by the flames in the case of men, or in the case of women, the breasts and the nose. Afterwards, the bodies were left up for 3 days, after which they were tossed into a shallow grave. Immolation was typically meted out for those who had been convicted of arson or attempted arson. It was also associated with the execution of Christians who refused to recount their faith after the Tokugawa shogunate outlawed Christianity. Finally, death by sawing was considered the heaviest death sentence during the Edo period. Technically, it implies to be sawed to death. However, the reality is, the execution was a bit different from what the name implies. To understand the background of this sentence, we have to examine this execution method during the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period, which had immediately preceded the Edo period. The Tokugawa shogunate's consolidation of power over Japan had largely marked the transition and start of the Edo period. During the Sengoku period, the prisoner was buried in the ground with only their head and neck sticking out of the ground, and the aggrieved party's family members would slowly take turns sawing the neck of the prisoner with a bamboo saw. Passerbys are said to have been encouraged to take part in the sawing as well. This process could take up to a week, and executions that took place over several days were not uncommon. Additionally, the bamboo saw was apparently not particularly good at sawing human flesh, so it was said to be especially painful and slow. In the Edo period, sentences of death by sawing were handed out, but the execution was a bit different. The condemned was placed in a box a little bit bigger than their body, with the neck and the head sticking out. The box was then partially buried, and a bamboo saw and an iron saw were placed against the box, on either side of the neck of the condemned. Some sort of signage indicating the offense was usually on display. The condemned would be left like this for 3 days and 2 nights, after which they would be released from the box, and instead crucifixion would be carried out. This sentence, being the most severe of the 6, was meant for those who had murdered their master. Apparently, actually sawing a person's head off was where the sensibilities of Edo period Japan drew the line. Crucifying and spearing the prisoner was completely acceptable, though. It should be noted that while these sentences were codified, the authorities of Edo-era Japan saw them more as guidelines. Ultimately, it was left up to the magistrates on how to handle the sentencing, and deviations from these guidelines, sometimes even using completely different execution methods, was not unheard of. Also, these sentences only applied to commoners. The bushi, the warrior caste, of whom the samurai would fall under socially, were not subject to them. In the case of bushi, they were expected to perform seppuku, which allowed the offender to regain their honor in death. In the cases where the offender refused to commit seppuku, for example, the samurai was Christian and therefore could not commit suicide for religious reasons, they would then be beheaded. In 1667, the Kozukappara Hokokusan Eko-in was opened next to the execution grounds. This temple is the same one that you would have passed entering the train station, the one with the large golden Tokugawa mon on the front. This Buddhist temple was to provide prayers and services for the dead. In 1698, a large stone engraved with the Nichiren Buddhist mantra Namu Myoho Renge Kyo was erected by the temple. This mantra, according to Nichiren adherents, is supposed to reduce suffering by cleansing negative karma. In 1741, a 3-meter tall statue called the Kubikiri Jizo, which translates to beheading Jizo, was also erected. While the Kozukappara execution grounds were in operation, the Jizo and the engraved stone mantra stood on the temple grounds next to the entrance to the execution grounds. Both the engraved stone and the Jizo are still around today. In fact, the statue you might have glimpsed as the train left the station was in fact the very same Jizo. Starting in 1771, scholars of Rangaku, That is, Japanese academics who were interested in Western science began carrying out dissections on the corpses of the prisoners. This was done in an effort to verify the validity of Dutch medical anatomy books they had recently acquired. The Tokugawa government would eventually fall in 1868, ending the shogunate in Edo and thus marking the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. In 1873, as part of the new government's efforts to modernize Japan and address criticism that Japan lacked basic human rights standards, it was decided to decommission the execution grounds. At the time of its shuttering, the execution grounds had been in operation for 222 years, and it's estimated over 200,000 souls are believed to have met their end here. In 1895, when the rail lines were being built, the decision was made to place the tracks right over the former execution grounds. The Kubikiri Jizo and the engraved stone were moved to its current location on the south side of the tracks. In 1982, the smaller isolated portion on the south side became its own temple called Enmeiji. Over the years, remodeling and expansion of the rail lines necessitated excavation of the ground underneath the rail line. In 1960, during the construction of the Hibiya line, so many bones were dug up that they had to temporarily create a giant mound of bones in front of the Jizo. In 1998, when the Tsukuba Express line was being put in, wooden barrel-like containers filled with human skulls were unearthed. Researchers counted 104 skulls in those containers. From 2001 to 2002, a survey was conducted that estimated there is approximately 2 bodies per square meter underneath the soil. It appears that over its 222-year history, the executed were just buried repeatedly right on top of each other in essentially mass graves, largely without being separated, resulting today in layers of human remains on top of human remains. Given the history of the execution grounds and the very likely reality that there are probably tens of thousands of human remains still buried in the ground underneath the rails, it's not surprising to learn that there are tales of paranormal encounters in the vicinity of the train station. Most of the paranormal encounters appear to revolve around Enmeiji, and specifically the Kubikiri Jizo. To a lesser extent, reports are found at Ekoin and the station itself. There are also a large number of photos taken around the two temples that people claim to show ghosts. Typically, these are the floating balls of light type that are typical in Japanese culture. Reports of unexplained feelings of sudden oppressive depression and feelings of intense unease are by far the most common at all of these sites. Although, knowing how many lives were ended on these grounds, how many remains are still buried beneath the ground, and being able to look at the exact same Jizo and the large mantra stone that loomed large over the condemned as they walked through the gates of the execution grounds, seems like that would be enough to make anyone feel saddened. In any event, there are many who claim to have encounters with the paranormal at the former Kozukappara execution grounds, and maybe you will too. As the train continues forward, we leave the ghosts of Kozukappara behind. Our next encounter with the past is just around the bend, but it's easy to miss. Partially obscured by the trappings of modern Tokyo, what we are looking for is the blue-tiled roof of yet another temple, Jokanji, the final resting place of the women of Yoshiwara, next time on Ghostly Japan. Thank you for watching. In the next video, we'll continue our exploration of this haunted train ride. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, please consider hitting the like and subscribe. Have a wonderful evening, and see you in the next installment of Ghostly Japan.